What's up, guys? I'm LQ. This is the LQ Review, and I've got something interesting to go over with you guys today. I'm a teacher, and before we went on lockdown, before school canceled indefinitely, I actually had a little poll with my students. And the poll was, what is your favorite Star Wars movie? They were only allowed to pick one. Between the 9 episodes, the two spin-off movies, Solo and Rogue One, and the Clone Wars animated movie, which was a theatrically released movie, they were allowed to pick one. They were also allowed to pick a 13th option. And that 13th option is I haven't seen any of the Star Wars movies. And so I ended up polling 128 students. And the results were interesting. I'm going to share those results with you just in percentages. So what movie got what percentage of the votes? And I'll do it in a ranking style. I'll start with 13 and move up to number 1. Before we do that, while we've been on lockdown, I made my wife watch episodes 1 through 9. I didn't bother with any of the spin-off movies, but we did watch episodes 1 through 9, and she's never seen them before. She did say, so I made her pick which trilogy was your favorite, the prequel trilogy, the original trilogy, or the sequel trilogy. Her favorite, she said, was the sequel trilogy. I thought that was really interesting. She said that the original trilogy was her second favorite, and her least favorite was the prequel trilogy. So this is somebody, in her mid-30s who had never seen, a female in her mid-30s who had never seen any Star Wars movies, who picked the sequel trilogy as her favorite. Interesting. All right, but let's go through these percentages. So at number 13, getting 0 votes, so 0%, is the Clone Wars. Nobody voted for that. Nobody voted for that. I was a little surprised it didn't get any votes out of 128 people that I polled, but it got 0. Number 12, at 2%. 2% of the votes went to Solo, a Star Wars story. Very, very few people voted for that, just 2%. Number 11 went to, at just over 2%. At just over 2%, number 11 went to Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. That one polled very low with my students. Not really surprising. A lot of my students are very divisive on the sequel trilogy. Some love it, some hate it. But I think that for anybody, the sequel trilogy is going to be, I think Episode 8 is going to score low. For anybody, whether you love the sequel trilogy or hate the sequel trilogy, Episode 8 is going to score low. So Episode 8 got a little over 2% of the votes. Number 10, at about 3% of the votes, was Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. About 3% of the vote, and that's actually my least favorite Star Wars movie. I guess the Clone Wars is my least favorite, but out of the live-action ones, Episode 1 is actually my least favorite. So I'm not surprised that it scored low, because really it's not a very good movie. It had some great stuff in it. Duel of the Fates is great. The Darth Maul, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan duel is great. The pod race scene is a lot of fun, but as a whole, it's a very weak movie. And I wasn't surprised that that one scored low at number 10. Number 9, which did surprise me because this is one of my favorite Star Wars movies, is Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. It got about 4% of the votes. And it surprised me because the kids who I polled, the sequel trilogy is their Star Wars, right? It's the one that's coming out during their youth. And I always thought that Episode 7 was very strong. One of the stronger of the Star Wars movies. But Episode 7, The Force Awakens, ended up at number 9. Number 8, with 6% of the votes, went to Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. So it's kind of one of those middle movies. Got 6% of the votes, so a number of people voted for it. And in conversation with people, they really liked the last 40 minutes. The arena on Geonosis. And that tends to be what really got this one some votes, was because a lot of kids I talked to who voted for this really loved that sequence. So that's number 8. Number 7, also at about 6% of the votes, but it had a couple more votes than Episode 2, and that's Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, at number 7. Again, not really surprising to me. I think for a lot of us old school fans, episode 4 has a lot of nostalgia, but by today's standards, it's kind of a tame movie. Even the lightsaber duel between Vader and Obi-Wan, it's kind of a tame lightsaber duel. Everything about it, by today's standards, is tame. Yeah, it's got a lot of nostalgia, and it kind of set the template for what Star Wars is. But today's audience, I kind of thought wouldn't view it. Today's kids, I thought wouldn't view it as favorably as some other movies, and I ended up being right because episode 4 is at number 7. Number 6 is Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. That got 9% of the votes. So a lot of kids in high school liked Episode 9. They ranked it number 6. Not surprising. I liked Episode 9 quite a bit, but I really expected a lot of my students to, just because it kind of has that. It has the action that the kids like. It has a lot of the comedy that kids like in movies today, but it also had the star-crossed lovers. And yeah, a lot of kids liked it. They ranked it number 6 with 9% of the votes. Number five with 10% of the votes was I haven't seen any of the Star Wars movies. So there you go. Number 5, haven't seen any. 10% of the votes. Number 4 is, with 11% of the votes, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. On the whole, my students really like this movie. From Order 66 on, they love it. So this one was really popular amongst my students. Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Number 3, with 13% of the votes, is Rogue One, a Star Wars story. And that one surprised me because I feel like some of the enjoyment out of Rogue One is how it connects to A New Hope. And in this case, that didn't seem to matter because they ranked this one so much higher than A New Hope. You know, New Hope got 6% of the votes. This one got 13% of the votes. So I think a lot of it comes down to the action, the sacrifice that the characters make. Those are all themes that kids like today in their movies. Is that the sacrifice, setting yourself, putting others ahead of yourself. That's definitely a theme that I hear my students like in movies, and that's something that obviously Rogue One has a lot of. So that's number 3, Rogue One with 13%. Number 2 with 14%, just beating out Rogue One, is Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. As a Star Wars fan, I always expect people to put Episode 5 as their number 1. But in this case, it was number 2. And it was number 2 by a commanding amount. Because number 1, with 20% of the votes, so 1 out of every 5 votes, went to Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. And that one kind of surprised me a little bit. But I guess it shouldn't, because this is the one that wraps up the Anakin Skywalker story. You know, we know the sequel trilogy deals with the legacy of Anakin and Darth Vader. But Episode 6 really wraps up his story. And so many of my students like Episode 5. So many of my students liked Episode 3. So many of my students like these Vader stories, that having the story that wraps up Anakin's storyline, I guess it makes sense that the students would like it. And that's what they told me when I talked to them about it when they were voting. Was, yeah, I liked it because of the throne room scene on the Death Star at the end. Vader turning good, Vader defeating the Emperor, the redemption that happened in Episode 6. Yeah, it had the Ewoks, which is kind of silly. The stuff on Endor was a lot of fun. The stuff in Jabba's palace was a lot of fun. But they loved the redemption of Vader. And for whatever reason, that resonated with my students. And it resonated a lot because 20% of them voted for Episode 6. So I just thought that was an interesting take on Star Wars. You know, everybody that I polled on this was a 9th grader through a 12th grader. 128 of them starting in 9th grade all the way up to 12th grade. And yeah, Episode 6 Return of the Jedi was by far their favorite. So I don't know if this means anything or what kind of data we can necessarily take from this, but I do think it's interesting that Rise of Skywalker scored so high. And at the same time, The Last Jedi scored so low. But I also think that this tells us a couple things. Number one, the prequels are relevant to this generation. Episode 3 scored very high. So the prequels are relevant. Episode 1 and Episode 2 maybe not so much, but Episode 3 is extremely relevant to this generation. This tells me that the original trilogy is still the favorite trilogy, with Episode 6 and Episode 5 taking the top 2 spots. But this also tells me that today's generation, these kids, have more or less gotten on board with the Disney versions of Star Wars, with Rogue One and Episode 9 all being very high ranking. Now, Solo ranked extremely low, but Solo was a Star Wars movie that nobody was kind of asking for in the first place. So, I don't know. I think that when I look at Episode 9 scoring so high with this group, I think that it's interesting to note that Episode 9 is very divisive amongst Star Wars fans. But did it speak to today's generation, to the young kids who will be the Star Wars fans that carry the torch moving on? And it looks like it did. So, at least in my little part of the world, Episode 9 spoke to today's generation. And that, I think, will give Star Wars momentum moving into whatever next phase they move into, whether it be the High Republic or the Old Republic or a new trilogy with Rey. You know, I don't know what they're talking about, the High Republic, but who knows what they're going to actually do. But I think that it's going to have some momentum moving in, because I think that moving on, because I think that today's generation, the kids who are going to carry the torch, who are going to be the torch carriers for the next generation of Star Wars fans, they liked Episode 9. That's kind of what I took out of this. So, I don't know. Take it for what you will. But thank you so much for being here to listen to my nerdy data on the Star Wars movies. And make sure you subscribe to my channel. And as always, appreciate you joining me here on the Oki Review, where we get to talk about all the geeky, nerdy stuff we love to talk about. Until next time, we'll see you guys later.